raising their hand. What is one of the 4 things that makes up almost all of your body? Yes, sir. Hydrogen. And hydrogen is the one that, if we counted the atoms, actually makes up the most of them. Who's got another one? Yes. Nitrogen is another one. Yes, sir. Oxygen, and one more. Yeah, carbon. So these are the 4 that make up basically everything that's in your body. And you'll see that as we do the next few lessons, those are the 4 that we're going to focus on because they are what carbohydrates and proteins and lipids are made out of. Now, if I was to rank them, remember, hydrogen was number 1. And if you think about what hydrogen is a part of, it's a part of water, but it's also a part of those other 3 types of molecules that I just mentioned, carbohydrates and fats and proteins. And so that's why there is so gosh darn much of it. So if we were marking this, let's say that's out of 4. There were 4 things that I was asking you. Did you know what the 4 of them were? The other question is, if that's all you had, would you be able to survive? And I said to defend. It will happen quite regularly in biology where there would be more than one way to answer a question as long as you supported what you said with some valid proof for your argument. So for the second part of this question, I would like to know what some of your reasons were. You could have said yes or you could have said no, as long as you had something to support your answer. Would anyone like to share what they wrote with everybody else? No one's brave. Oh, someone's brave. Go ahead. So, a really good way of supporting the answer no would be to state something else that you have and to say what it's needed for. And so by saying that we need calcium for our bones and we need iron in our blood because it carries oxygen, that would be excellent support for why you would say no. Now I hope that most people thought that no was probably the easier one to support. Did anybody say yes and maybe want to tell me what they wrote there? I think the answer is no too, and it's because if I only had those 4 things, I would not be able to do a lot of functions that require a small amount, even though it might not be one of the 4 major ones, a small amount of some other substance. So if you take a look at that list that I gave you, I listed a whole bunch of different things on it. Some of them were weird and some of them were not. For example, like you mentioned, calcium is for bones, iron is for blood. There were some other substances on that list, like gold and silver, that don't necessarily have a function. And so if you had perhaps said yes, you might have been basing your answer on the fact that some of those elements don't actually do anything. They don't do anything to support life. And so not every element on that list is necessary for survival. Calcium and iron would be 2 of the really good examples of ones that are. Other elements that would be really important for survival off of this list, for example, would be sulfur. Sulfur is part of most proteins because it helps them with their structure. You also have a few other things like iodine. Iodine helps make a hormone that you have. It's called your thyroid hormone. And so some of these things you might not realize what they're for, and as we go through the course Bio 20, and if you stick with it in Bio 30, you'll actually learn what a lot of these things do for you. I heard a few people questioning whether or not we had chloride ions in our body anywhere, and I asked someone if they had ever eaten salt, because if they had, then you definitely would. And they do have a function. They're not just there because. Potassium, which is K, and sodium are both really essential for your brain to function. So those are some of the ones that are necessary, that you could use to support an answer that asked you, if you only had hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon, would you survive? Well, no, because we have all these other things that even though their percentage might not be high, their role is very important. So for this, I would give two marks. Did you give an answer and did you defend? So what we did on that sheet with all of the different elements that were there was actually start to identify what our body is made of. There are two basic categories: micromolecules and macromolecules. Now, micromolecules aren't actually usually referred to by that name, but I wanted to have a comparable title for both sections. Macro means big, and micro means small. So on Friday, we talked about how science is really a whole nother language, and so very frequently I will tell you what little pieces of the words mean so that you can have a good idea of what the definition of something is. Now, a macromolecule is usually a big molecule, and even more than that, it's something that occurs very frequently. So when we mentioned that carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are used most often, they are the things that make up macromolecules. All of the other elements are what make up the other category. So let's talk about the smaller things first. I put a few different things in this particular list. You'll notice that I put nitrogen on this side because although it's one of the four main things, its percent is really small. Like it's 1%, whereas the other ones make up the other 98%. And so I mentioned just a few of them here just so that you could see what some of them do. So N, which is nitrogen, makes up amino acids, which are actually the small pieces that make up proteins. Calcium, like someone mentioned earlier, is necessary for the development of your bones. P stands for phosphorus. It's useful for energy storage. Fe stands for iron. And RBC isn't the abbreviation for a bank. That is how biologists refer to red blood cells. And so when we get to the section on circulation, we'll talk a lot more specifically about how that works. Na is sodium. Sodium, like I mentioned earlier, is really important for nerve impulse and for water regulation. And in this category, we also have other things. So all of these elements we usually refer to as minerals. So when you hear the word mineral, what we really mean most of the time is an inorganic compound or simply a chemical element. Vitamins also fall in this category, but vitamins are what we would call organic compounds. And so I'd like to ask if anyone knows the difference between organic and inorganic. Not in terms of farming practices, because that's a different sense. In the sense of maybe what's the difference between a mineral and a vitamin? So I'll tell you. Inorganic compounds don't contain carbon. Organic ones do. And before we started using the word organic to talk about whether or not we used pesticides during farming, that's really what it means. If any of you are pursuing chemistry and you take Chem 30, there is a whole unit in Chem 30 just about organic chemistry, which are compounds that have carbon as the basis of their structure. So in the category of things that we need less of, or things that exist in smaller amounts, we have elements that don't have carbon, and there's a list of them at the top, and we have vitamins that do. Now we're not going to get really specific about vitamins in terms of all of the different types and what each one of them does, but I wanted to give you an example of an inorganic and an organic thing that went in this category. On this side is macromolecules. These are the things that are big and that we need the most of. So in terms of how much we have of everything, we have our three things, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. And hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon make up most of the structure of these four things. These four things are the macromolecules that we are going to discuss. In fact, we're actually only really going to discuss the first three: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Nucleic acids, which are the pieces that your DNA is made up of, are technically a macromolecule. But since there is an entire unit in Bio30 on DNA, we are not going to focus on that a lot now. We're going to focus on the other ones. Now, if you look, those are the three things that you were supposed to eat when you eat things: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Lipids is a fancy way of saying fat. And all of those types of molecules are made up of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. So all three of those are found in all of these. Now, there are other types of atoms in each one of them that make them distinctive, but something that they have in common is oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. I will find those in all types of macromolecules. Now, what we're going to do, and this is what our lab is going to be about, is we're going to talk about how we could tell, or how we could test, to see if something contained a carbohydrate, something contained a protein, something contained a lipid or a fat. And so the beginning of lesson 2, which will involve the lab that we're going to do tomorrow as well, which I've titled "What's in My Lunch," is a little chart that has some different tests that we could do for macromolecules. Now, our macromolecules that we're really interested in are these three. And so in our lab tomorrow, we're going to perform some tests where the result will indicate whether or not one of those is present. So you'll notice that there are several different types of tests, more tests than there are categories. And that's because there are actually more than one type of carbohydrate. The first two tests are both for carbohydrates, and the last two tests are both for lipids or fats or oils. So if we take a look at the list, you'll see that there are 5 test names. It lists which nutrient each of them tests for, and then what happens during the test. So we're just going to take a minute. So there's 5 different tests that we could use to detect whether or not different types of macromolecules are there. The first one is called the Benedict Test. Now, Benedict's test starts with a solution that is blue. So if you look at the picture over here, that's about the color of a normal Benedict solution. And you'll notice that this is the only one that really has a bunch of choices for what can happen. These colors are all possible end results. And the color that happens at the end is all based on the concentration. So that's why there are so many choices. Basically, what you should know is that for the Benedict test, if it's anything but blue at the end, it means that there was a carbohydrate there. Now, the specific type of carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Now, some of you would remember learning in Science 10 that mono means one. Saccharide means sugar. So we'll talk about this in our next few lessons when we talk about carbohydrates. But a monosaccharide is a simple sugar, something that is made up of one sugar unit. So things like glucose and fructose that you would often see on labels, those are monosaccharides. So when you think of sugar, sugary things, plain old simple sugar, table sugar isn't a monosaccharide. It's actually bigger than that. But this type of test tests for small sugars. The iodine test is another test for carbohydrates, but it only tests for starch. Starch is what we would call a polysaccharide. Poly means many. And so a polysaccharide is a carbohydrate made up of many, many, many small units of sugars. So where would I find something like a monosaccharide and something like starch? A monosaccharide is something that you would find typically in a fruit. Fruits have monosaccharides in them. So if you think of something generally as having some sort of sweetness to them, there's probably a monosaccharide there. Starch is the kind of thing that you find in a potato. Starch is typically a storage form, whereas sugar is something that the plant is readily using. Now the iodine test, if you look over here, starts orangey yellow, and the degree of orange in the color just depends how many drops you put in. If you put only one in, it looks fairly yellow. The final color, if there is a starch present, is that it turns really, really dark blue. In fact, so dark blue that it looks black most of the time. The only time you can get it to look blue is if you put very, very little iodine in. Now, if it didn't change color, if it stayed orange or yellow, that would tell you that there's not a starch present. The Burette test is over here. The Burette test tests for protein. It starts out blue, and it changes either pink or purple. And again, it's kind of like the Benedict test. It depends on concentration and how much there is. But if it's not blue at the end, and it's changed to pink or purple, we know that there's a protein present. Now, one of the things that I'll mention, in particular with this test, because we're going to do it tomorrow, is that sometimes things that have proteins in them are kind of thick, and they don't mix really well with a solution. So it doesn't matter if the whole entire test tube changes color. Even if you got a band of color change across the top, that would still be indicative of a protein being present. Now we have Sudan 4. It's another type of liquid. It starts out pink and it turns red. And it will change color if there is a fat present. And even easier than that is the translucence test, and that's the one that we're going to do tomorrow. In the translucence test, if you've ever eaten at a fast food joint, you will have seen this test in action. You get a brown paper bag, there's a gross greasy stain that makes it see-through. That's the translucence test. Only lipids, fats, or oils take brown paper and make it appear semi-clear after they've touched it for a while.